Good evening. Welcome on behalf of the Devonport Library Associates to this evening. I mean, this is the 10th one we've had this year, and the crowds have been overwhelming, so we wish to celebrate that with you guys tonight. We've got a pretty full program, as you can see from the esteemed guests that are here, but just a couple of acknowledgements. The first to Creative Community for their help and support. They're filming our events. You'll see evidence of that next year. We're working currently on next year's program, and any input or ideas, feed them to Jan Mason in particular. We want to have another vital program such as we've had this year. I'm going to we've got two brief presentations before the main course tonight, so I'd like to hand over to Jan Mason.
Hello everybody. Okay, not often I get to do this, but it's a great pleasure when I do. Jan Douglas, step up here please. So we are about to honour Jan. Many years ago, Jan was accosted in the Devonport supermarket by Dennis Oldham, who was the current chair, and pretty much told, because we know Dennis very well, that she would be treasurer from henceforth, and she has been. And she's done an absolutely amazing, wonderful job. I've never had to think about those dollars and cents, and that is the mark of a person who's doing their job very, very well. So we thank you for that. And how many years?
14.
14 years. Wow. So, but the good news is that Jan will stay on the committee. Now, Jan is a person I very much value for her thoughtfulness and her kindness and her consideration, and I know that one of the highlights of her job has been providing a warm welcome when you lot come in the door, with a slight dig to pay your koha and your sup, only slight though. But anyway, Jan, we've got a yummy box of chocolates, and there's a ticket in there to the event centre in town, the Edge, Ticketek. So eat the chocolates, listen to some yummy music, and thank you.
Thank you, Jan, very much. And I just want to say I joined 14 years ago, and the change in the Devonport Library Associates over this time has been extraordinary. And a lot of the reason for it is Jan Mason, who's our president, or chairperson, or whatever you call her these days. We've had such a wealth of great speakers, and it just goes on. So it's now, I'm close to my 80th birthday, and I think, oh my God, this is very significant. And I think it's about time that I gave up the treasurer's job. It's been passed over to Ian in the meantime. And it's been lovely working with the very nice people, very good, very capable people on the committee. So I feel as though a lot of people, I know you by face and often by name. I hope I'll see more of you at more meetings. Thank you.
Right, we have another very special presentation tonight. It's from a Devonport author, a very distinguished one. He's standing up there at the moment, Paul Williams. Paul, would you step forward and perhaps say something about your book?
Yes, thank you. Ooh. I see we've got to speak two ways here, haven't we? I have written a book called New Zealand Landscape, I wrote it partly because I thought, well, everybody in New Zealand that I know is passionate about our landscape, just as we are about looking after our bodies. But you know, we know very little about our bodies, most of us anyway, and frankly we know very little about our landscape. And I thought, well, I'll try to do something about this. All of us, I'm sure, have been on long drives in the country and seen that fantastic view, almost taken our breath away. We struggle for our camera to capture that shot, and we store it away like a postcard. We recognise the beauty, but do we know why it's there? When we look at the Southern Alps, which you'll see on the cover of the book, are they getting bigger? Will they get as big as the Himalayas? Or not? If we think about Ruapehu, do we realise it was only the whole of Ruapehu and all its plain around it is only 5% of the size of an eruption 350,000 years ago? Only 5% of the size of an eruption 350,000 years ago. Now, there's lots of things about the New Zealand landscape we don't see. We see with our camera, but we don't understand. So I've written this book to try to bridge the gap. Now, I'd read Michael King's book about the history of New Zealand, and I thought, well, I'd love to write a book about the history of the landscape of New Zealand. But whereas a history all of us can understand because it's talking about people and places and events, and it's accessible consequently to people, it's actually very difficult to write a science book that is accessible to people. Because you have the choice. You can either be declamatory in your style, and that's that, you say how things are. But I hesitated and thought, look, my fellow scientists are going to be reading that, and they're going to say to me, hey Paul, why did you say that? What's the proof? So I knew immediately I had to write a book with evidence in the backgrounds, in the bibliography, so I could defend the things that were said. So that book, I'm afraid, is written really for first-year university students, for the intelligent layperson, let's put it that way. So it's not a novel, and unlike Graeme's books here, which I guess most of us in the room have read, I'm not sure many of you will read my book, but you might enjoy the pictures. There's 200 pictures and 200 diagrams, and I hope it does justice to New Zealand.
Could Linda step forward from the library so you can present the book to her?
Okay. Linda, Val and Calvin Grant were the closest friends I had in Devonport, and they were for 30-odd years. Consequently, with Val, I actually discussed the title of this book. I was going to call it, you'll see the subtitle, Behind the Scene. She said, well, that's a clever title. But I discussed it with the publishers, who were international science publishers, and the publishers said, well, look, if you do that on the website, no one will know where it is. So it will be invisible. So now it's a subtitle. Sorry, Val. Now, just before I go, and this is just for completeness, now this is deadly stuff, this is real science. I wrote this one with a friend 30 years ago. It's gone to second edition and it's been translated into Chinese and published by the Geoscience Ventures of China. It's about limestone, it's about caves, about climate change and things like that. 15% of the continent is made of limestone, and about 40% of the global population depends on its groundwater for drinking. It's not important in New Zealand because we've got a tiny amount of limestone, but it's enormously important in many places. That's for completeness.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful how many fabulous authors we have in Devonport here, and Paul is in a genre of academic publishing. That book is a very expensive book, and it's a great coup for the library to have a copy. On to the main event of the evening. We've got three absolutely distinguished guests here who scarcely need any introduction. If I could just introduce them briefly. Firstly, we have Tessa. Tessa is the adjudicator or the judge tonight. She's the arbiter. She is the voice of reason. Okay. She is, of course, we all know, an outstanding author. All of us can recall many of the books that she's read. She's an accomplished sailor. So on a theme such as we've got tonight, she's the right person for the job, and particularly with her association with the spirit of New Zealand, but with sailing all around New Zealand and particularly Auckland waters. She's won many awards. She's the holder of the OBE for Distinguished Services to Literature. She is indeed a grand lady. Second speaker, of course, is Graeme Lay. Graeme, of course, is, I think, probably the most prolific author coming in Devonport at the moment. His output is enormous. Just in the last 2 or 3 years, I've probably read 4 or 5 books by Graeme. He's an expert, of course, on the Pacific, and that's where we're going to be spending this evening. And of course, his trilogy on Cook has been an outstanding work, and of course, he's followed it up with his more recent work on Fletcher Christian, which you can purchase, of course, if you are so disposed. But they are incredibly good reads, and as I say, Graeme really has made a huge contribution to our understanding of our coastline and of our history. The third speaker, of course, is Kieran Raftery. Kieran, of course, has been a citizen of Devonport for over 30 years. He is, I guess, an expert prosecutor. When you look at the list of names, whose prosecution he's been involved in, you can really wonder. I mean, a name like Bain, currently Kim.com, and of course finally as prosecutor on behalf of the British government, Her Majesty's Britannic government, against some of the citizens of Pitcairn Island. So a particular welcome to Kieran. I'm going to hand over now to Tessa to launch the evening.
I'll stand up for this bit, but I think probably if you can bear with us at the back, once we get going, it might be more relaxed for us if we can remain seated. Thank you, Paul, on behalf of the three of us. I'm not really here so much as an adjudicator as I think maybe a scene setter. My job is to just give you a few facts. I hope they're proper facts and not, you know, there are no fact checkers in the audience. And allow these two gentlemen to do most of the talking. You may have perhaps deduced from the Graeme's book that he's written on Fletcher of the Bounty that he's going to be speaking mostly about and for Fletcher Christian, and Kieran will be speaking for and about William Bligh. And then we'll see what the audience reaction is at the end, I think, which will be quite exciting. So I just want to perhaps mention the format of the evening. Each is going to describe in turn their protagonist's early life and family background, moving on to the aims of the Bounty expedition and the voyage out and the problems that were developing on board at quite an early stage, the characters of the two and their abilities and their flaws and their particular aspects they brought to the voyage. Then we'll move to the discussion of the famous Bounty and the mutiny, and then after that the significance of the mutiny even today. So I'm just going to give you a few very brief facts as a recap of the Bounty's fateful voyage and the mutiny itself. The HMS Bounty was a small merchant ship purchased by the Royal Navy for a botanical mission to acquire breadfruit plants and transport them as food for slaves to British possessions in the West Indies. Under the command of Captain William Bligh, who at this stage was only 36, the ship arrived in Tahiti on October the 26th, 1788, and remained more than 5 idyllic months. Plants were nurtured, island hospitality enjoyed at every level, naval discipline fatefully slackened. On April the 4th, Bounty set sail for the West Indies. Back in UK, the ship's great cabin had been refitted as a plant nursery, taking so much space that meant that no Marines, those sort of nautical police, were carried among the crew of 46. This was very, very unusual and very a real factor in this whole story. There were 2 botanists on board who were going to nurture the 1,000 or so plants they took back. Bligh was the sole commissioned officer, and Fletcher Christian was serving as his acting lieutenant. He'd been promoted quite recently, so he was in fact second in command. So I'd like to hand over to Graeme to tell us something about the early life of Fletcher Christian and his family origins and the circumstances under which he came to sea and found himself on the Bounty in that year.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tessa. Fletcher Christian became a subject of fascination with me. I had seen the movies, all of the movies, there have been 4 of them, and he was depicted in various ways. Some of them, the first film, Errol Flynn played Fletcher, and it's the most dreadful film I think I've ever seen. It's laughable. I was on a cruise ship giving a lecture about the mutiny a couple of years ago, and they showed that film. Why they chose that one, I have no idea. But as we left the theatre, I heard one man say, if they show that film again, there'll be another mutiny on the ship. And I couldn't help but agree. Anyway, so Fletcher Christian, I think I must have first encountered him in the classic comics. Do you remember the classic comics? That was my introduction to the story. And I thought the story was terrific, but mostly books that I read focused on Bligh. There was an awful lot of material about Bligh, and he certainly was a very interesting man. Not so much about Fletcher. So I dug around and found a little bit about his life. He was born into a fairly well-to-do family in Cumbria, in northwest England, born in 1764. And his family were very well connected. They weren't aristocratic, they weren't from the nobility, but they were very well connected. His father had been a lawyer, and his family origins were on the Isle of Man, across the Irish Sea. And Fletcher's father died when the boy was only 4, so he didn't really know his father, so his mother had a huge influence on his life. Anne Dixon, her name was. And they lived in great comfort in a house called Moorland Close, just outside Cockermouth, which is the town where Fletcher had his schooling. So he went to the local school. He was a very good student, keen on learning. He was specialised in history and the classics. He was a popular boy. One of his classmates was William Wordsworth, 10 years younger than Fletcher, so they wouldn't have been in the same age group, but that connection was so good I couldn't help resisting to put it into the novel, that Fletcher and William had a meeting on the outskirts of the town. But after he entered his teens, he was about 16 or 17, his mother became bankrupt. She borrowed a huge amount of money, about $750,000 in today's funds, I think mainly to finance her other 2 sons through university. Edward read law at Cambridge, Charles took medicine at Edinburgh University, and that was very, very costly. Now Fletcher had always wanted to go to Cambridge. He wanted to read classics, he wanted to read history, and one day his mother announced that he could not go to Cambridge because she was bankrupt. Now that must have had a huge effect on not only Fletcher but the whole family. And he said, well, what are we going to do? And she said, well, we'll go to the Isle of Man, we'll go to your father's family and live off their charity. Now, she wanted to do that because the Isle of Man has its own separate legal jurisdiction. And very interesting, this week, when the Paradise Papers were announced, the Isle of Man featured prominently. It's still a tax haven. And it was a tax haven right back in the 18th century when Fletcher crossed there with his mother to live there. So he spent a couple of years on the island, still nurturing resentment that he hadn't been able to go to Cambridge. He worked on his cousin's farm. He had led a very healthy outdoor life. But always regretted that he couldn't go to university. However, the Isle of Man was had two important seaports, Ramsey in the north and Douglas in the south, and it was a very important base for Royal Navy patrol boats, because a lot of contraband came into England via the Isle of Man from Ireland and from the continent, and a lot of the patrol boats were sailing around the island looking for smugglers all the time. One of those patrol boats was commanded by William Bligh. A little bit later, I'll tell you about that. Fletcher, I think at that stage, when he was about 16 or 17, he must have decided, I can't go to university, I'll go to sea. Now that was a very drastic decision to make, because none of his family had ever been at sea. They were a legal family on his father's side. A lot of his father's relatives were deemsters. You know that word, Kieran? Deemster? I hadn't encountered it before, but it must be a local word for a judge. So they were a distinguished legal family. And Fletcher, I think, must have seen the patrol boats coming in and out of the harbour and looked at the men scaling the rigging and thought, okay, I can do that. He was very fit and very athletic. Later on, when he was a midshipman, he achieved the distinction of being able to jump from one barrel into another with one leap. Now, don't ask me what practical application that could possibly have, but it was a feat of a physical skill, and it earned him the admiration of his fellow seamen. So Fletcher then decides, and it's a very dramatic decision, that he will go to sea. Now, Paul mentioned the cookbooks, as I call them. The stories, Cook's story and Fletcher's story, or certainly Bligh's story, overlap to some extent, because Cook's third and final voyage, on the Resolution with him was the sailing master called William Bligh. Now, he was only 22, Bligh, at that stage, and he went on an amazing voyage right across the Pacific to the Sandwich Islands, what we call today Hawaii, and he must have proved himself to be a very skilled seaman at that stage. Sailing master at 22 under the command of Cook, you had to be pretty good. And I've devised a scene whereby Fletcher is taken along to a club in Douglas, a gentleman's club, and he's introduced there to William Bligh. And Bligh, even at that stage, was a really fairly prickly sort of character. He didn't warm to Fletcher at all, but Fletcher knew that he could get a berth on one of Bligh's ships, because a terrible thing happened in 1783. Peace broke out in Europe. Now, that meant that the Royal Navy had no real demand anymore for sailors like Bligh and Fletcher, an aspiring sailor. So they were laid off from the Navy and put on half pay. Now, that was a dreadful thing to happen, because Fletcher had joined the Royal Navy first as a cabin boy at the age of 17, pretty old cabin boy, most of them are only 12 or 13. And he had gone to sea, served in the Caribbean, and then he went across to India, did a couple of voyages there. And he must have been very good at what he did, because he was promoted to midshipman, straight from cabin boy to midshipman. So his career was all set out for him. He loved the sea, he loved visiting exotic ports and so on as a young man, and his career seemed assured. Peace. terrible thing to happen. And he couldn't, his career was almost destroyed by that decision, political decision. But he, at that stage, realised that Bligh might be able to help him, because Bligh was in the same position. But Bligh had secured a command with the merchant marine. And he did that because he had very good connections on the Isle of Man. He'd married a woman called Elizabeth, Betsy he called her. Betsy Bligh's uncle was a very, very prosperous ship owner and plantation owner in Jamaica. And there were lots of opportunities for merchant seamen to cash in on that trade between England and Jamaica, all based on the slave trade. And there are scenes in the novel where Fletcher sails with, eventually Bligh decides he would take him on, and he becomes a mentor to him, and they sail off to the Caribbean. And Bligh defends the plantation system, saying that, well, if it wasn't for the slaves, you wouldn't have a job and neither would I. And Duncan Campbell, Fletcher's, Bligh's wife's uncle, was growing immensely rich. He also owned hulks on the Thames, you know, where they used to stuff the prisoners. So he was a very wealthy man, and provided Fletcher with that opportunity. And Bligh was very well paid by Duncan Campbell, and that solved his financial problems. But then an opportunity arose which took him back into the Royal Navy, and I'm sure that Karen will tell us about that now. I'll hand her over to William Bligh.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll just try without a microphone, and if you can't hear, just put up your hand. You'll have noticed from what Graeme has told you that he's already admitted to making up two bit of fabrication in his book. And all I'm just warning you about is be careful of that. He's told you about this meeting between him and some Lakeland poet when they were 10 years apart. They weren't even at school together, overlapping even for a week. So, and then this meeting in a pub in Ramsey didn't happen. So there's a lot of other stuff in that book you need to be really, really careful of if you're going to really get to know Bligh. As you'll have gathered from the flyer for this programme, Bligh was 10 years Fletcher's senior. He was born in 1754 in Cornwall. Exactly where he was born is unclear, because not much is known about his early life in detail. We know he was baptised in Plymouth, and his father worked for the Customs Service out of Plymouth. Not a particularly high rank in the Customs Service, a much more modest family than that of Fletcher Christian. Something that, in the refined nature of understanding the social peculiarities and the social pecking order in England, Fletcher would have been well aware of his subordinate position in the social pecking order, as would indeed many of those on the boats that Bligh sailed on. But it was a nice middle-range family. His ancestors had been mayors of Bodmin and things of that sort, and they'd been well established as a family in St Tudy in Cornwall since the early records go back to about 1680. He, in fact, was enrolled in the Navy at the age of 7. It wasn't uncommon for people to be enrolled that early, because you wanted to try and get as many years under your belt before you could get the role of a midshipman. And a lot of kids were enrolled at that age, and they just became ship's boys or cabin boys, and they were attached to the captain of the boat, and they were educated and so on and so forth. He only lasted 8 months, and then he was paid off, and so by the age of still 7, he was out of the Navy, and he didn't really join the Navy until he was 15 in 1770. And from then on, he had a naval career. You've already heard something of it from what Graeme has already told you. His naval career started, he was don't need to worry about 1770 to 1776, because the real point about his career when it took off was when he was the master on Resolution with Cook on his final voyage that you've just heard reference to. Now, as the master, you're in charge of the navigation of the expedition, in fact, because there were 2 ships, as many of you will know, on that last expedition of Cook's. And the sole responsibility stops with Cook, of course, but he relies very heavily on his master. And so he already must have had good navigational skills at that stage, and learnt much more from working with Cook. He was only aged 22, as you know, but already since the age of 15 when he joined the Navy, he'd become a midshipman within a matter of months, and then had developed his navigational skills. He was also a very fine draftsman. He'd done, over the course of his career, not talking up till now, done a lot of charting of waters, of harbours, and he continued to do that with Cook on that voyage. When Cook was killed in Hawaii in 1779, Charles Clark took over the expedition, but he was already quite a sick man, and he was to die a few months later while still on the voyage. But basically the running of that voyage was taken over by Bligh, who was then the navigator for their expedition. They were trying to find the Northwest Passage through to the UK from the Atlantic. They failed, but they certainly covered the South Pacific to the North Atlantic, and it was charted very well on many occasions by Bligh, and a lot of the islands were sketched by him and that sort of thing, not just on this, but on many of his expeditions. And these skills he was to continue right throughout his naval career. After he came back, after that Resolution voyage was over and they were back in the UK in 1780, he got married the following year to Betsy Beetham, as you've heard, in 1781, and then in 1782 was the first time he encountered Fletcher Christian, because he was then at the relief of Gibraltar. He was a lieutenant on HMS Calcutta, and the young Fletcher Christian, who was actually 16 at the time, was the ship's cabin boy, effectively, the ship's boy. And that's where they first met. And they were to meet again, as you've heard, in respect of the West Indian trade that Betsy Beetham's uncle was involved in, and he gave a job to Bligh when he was laid off during times of peace, when you go down to half pay, and then he earned a lot more on the West Indian trade. And on the last journey back from to and from the West Indies that he did before he rejoined the Royal Navy on Merchantman Britannia, again, he was then, by then, a lieutenant on that, and Fletcher Christian was, by then, a mate on that ship. So they had those two journeys together. Back in England in 1786, and as those of you will know, the Bounty sailed in 1787. And so when Bligh was choosing his company for that sailing, one of his chosen people was Fletcher Christian, because already they had quite a good relationship. He had actually, as 10 years his senior, he'd been teaching him a lot of the skills he himself had learnt from people like Cook and other captains he'd worked under, and so had taken Fletcher Christian under his wing. I'm going to skip over the Bounty, because that's the controversial bit, and then move on just to tell you something of his career after the Bounty, before we come back and hear a few more misleading things from Graeme. The objection. After Bligh returned, of course, and I will touch on this later, he himself faced a court-martial for losing the Bounty. He was acquitted, and then he was promoted following his acquittal to the position of captain. He'd been a lieutenant at the time when he was in command of the Bounty, and then he went on from there to do a lot of distinguished naval service, serving in a lot of important battles during the time. You remember at this stage England was at war with several aspects of Europe. Napoleon was in the ascendancy in France. There was a certain amount of tension between the two countries, and there were between others as well. And so there was a very famous Battle of Copenhagen, some of you may have heard about, with Nelson putting the telescope to his blind eye and failing to see Sir Hyde Parker's order to cease hostilities. But what history doesn't record is the other person who turned a blind eye to Sir Hyde Parker was William Bligh. And he backed Nelson to the hook, to the hilt, should I say, and then, so that he then sent the signal, Nelson's signal, down the line to the others behind him, and they all fell in behind Nelson. And as you know, Copenhagen was one of the great victories before we got to Trafalgar. And so for that, Nelson gave him a huge commendation, and the one little interesting twist is that one of the cabin boys on Nelson's boat at the time was a guy called Harrison Fryer, who was the son of John Fryer, the master of the Bounty, who was to play such a part in the saga and the later court-martials. And he was there to witness the commendation being given by Nelson to William Bligh for his particular prowess in the Battle of Trafalgar and the Battle of Copenhagen. There have been other battles as well, Camperdown and Doggerbank and things of that sort, that he'd been distinguished himself in and done a lot of very good work and received commendations as well of one sort or another. But then just moving forward a bit, he comes back from that after the next major thing on the horizon for him was 1806. He's appointed to Governorship of New South Wales. Gidley King, who had been there, had been finding it difficult to control a rather corrupt New South Wales Corps, sometimes called the Rum Corps. Bligh was sent out to try and sort it out. And at that stage, it was naval captains who tended to be sent, not necessarily the best politicians. And he fell out with everybody in Sydney, it would appear, and he tried to do what the British government asked him to do, was to stop the corrupt practices of the New South Wales Corps, to stop rum as the currency, and to take it away from them. And he fell out with the Corps, of course, and he also fell out with an important landowner called John MacArthur, who all governors fell out with. Lachlan Macquarie was to find out when he took over from Bligh, he had a pain in the side of every single governor that MacArthur was around for. But anyway, in the end result was MacArthur got the head of the New South Wales Corps, a guy called Johnston, to arrest Bligh, put him under arrest and overthrow him, and then they ran New South Wales as they fancied until Lachlan Macquarie came out to relieve him. They were then sent back to England. MacArthur couldn't be tried in a court-martial because he was a civilian, but Johnston was. He was found guilty of, again, mutiny, and he was convicted. And our hero, William Bligh, was promoted, and he became the first rank that he received of that really severe rank was a Vice Admiral of the Blue. As you'll probably know, they go red, white, and blue. And so you get the Reds, and you get the Admirals of the red, white, and blue, the Rear Admirals of the red, white, and blue, the Vice Admirals of the red, white, and blue. In 1814, he becomes a Rear Admiral of the Blue, so he's the 7th most senior naval officer in the British Navy. He retired at that rank, and he then went to live in Kent. In 1812, his wife had died. By then, she had 8 children. 2 sons were twins, had died shortly after birth. He had 6 daughters still living. One daughter came out as the First Lady in Sydney when he was there as governor, because his wife didn't want to travel and had other young daughters to look after. But it's clear that he was a very good family man, particularly fond of his daughters, and it was in fact after attending the wedding of his 3rd daughter that he succumbed to the stomach cancer that he had, and he died just a few days after that wedding in 1817. For those of you who know London, he's buried just round the corner from Lambeth Palace, the Archbishop of Canterbury's had in central London, in St Mary's Church, which is now the Museum of Garden History, along with his wife. And the house that he lived in is just up the road right opposite the Imperial War Museum, and it's still there. And so that's where he lived until he retired to Kent. And if you read the epitaph on his tomb, he was a distinguished naval officer, sad, as in the way of the 18th century, sadly lamented, sadly missed, and all sorts of accolades paid to him, unlike those in the book.
Thank you, Karen. You both set the scene very well for the 2 characters that we're concentrating on tonight. So I'd like to invite Graeme to tell us something about the aims of the Bounty expedition. We know it was to collect this breadfruit, but give us a little bit more background of that. We'll make this fairly sharp because we haven't reached the mutiny yet. That's the interesting bit. So can you give us some of the background?
Yes. Well, thank you, Karen, for that very over-flattering depiction of William Bligh. Just winding the story back a bit, you can't divorce the story from the politics of the time. And in 1776, the colonies, England's colonies on the east coast of America, declared their independence from Britain. Now, this was to have huge consequences for both countries, because the slave system, the plantation system of slavery in the West Indies, depended on food imported from North America, like rice and wheat and other grains like that, non-perishable foodstuffs. Now, when independence was declared, that avenue of food was cut off from the West Indies. England had nothing more to do with North America. It also ended their system of sending convicts across the Atlantic to North America. So there was a problem now for the plantation owners, because the slaves, and there were thousands of them working the sugar plantations mainly, they had the inconvenient habit of wanting to be fed well. And the plantation owners wanted them fed well, so they were healthy and worked hard in their shackles and so on. So into the story enters a very interesting person in the form of Joseph Banks. Now, many of you will know about Banks and what an extraordinary fellow he was. He sailed with Cook on the first voyage, and they were in Tahiti for a long time. Banks was a civilian naturalist who was very interested in plants. He was a collector of flora, and while he was in Tahiti, he noticed that this beautiful tree, the breadfruit tree, was a great source of food. The mature breadfruit could be baked or boiled or fried, and it was very nutritious, and even the conservative English sailors liked it, and they turned their nose up at anything that was different as a rule, but they loved the breadfruit. So Banks, back in England, a man of ideas, tremendous ideas, thought, well, why not take breadfruit from Tahiti, take the young plants across the world to the West Indies, climate was more or less identical, tropical climate, and grow the little breadfruit trees there, and you'd have a rich source of food for the slaves. Food growing on trees, literally. So Banks made that suggestion to George III, who was known as Farmer King. He was very keen on plants and very keen on agriculture, and he was enthusiastic about the idea. So the expedition was mounted, and as Kieran's pointed out, William Bligh was designated the commander. Banks knew Bligh, knew his abilities, which were, undoubtedly he was a very fine navigator. So the expedition was mounted. Well, almost from the start, things went wrong. The ship they bought, the Bethia, was small. The great cabin where Bligh would normally have been accommodated and did his navigation and so on, was filled up with racks of pottery containers, hundreds and hundreds of them, so nobody could have any room there. Or the crew's accommodation was very cramped. The ship had no marines, as Kieran's pointed out, which the whole thing was penny pinching. You could see it right from the start. No marines, no officers apart from Bligh himself. Bligh was already nursing a grievance against the Royal Navy in various ways. He wasn't made a captain early enough in his career. He'd had the misfortune on the Resolution voyage, Cook's third voyage, of having his charts and his surveys more or less stolen from him by the assistant sailing master on the vessel, and this chap took the credit for it. He was a man with a lot of grievances, but however, he could see the merit in this expedition, sailing across the world to Tahiti, which he had already been to, and he knew it well. So they set off just before Christmas, 1787. It had been delayed for 3 months already. The Admiralty didn't give him his sailing orders until the very last minute. He was frustrated at wanting to get away. Because it was approaching Christmas, the weather was turning bad. They couldn't get out of Portsmouth for several weeks. Eventually they got out and they struck gales in the Bay of Biscay. Things improved after that. They went sailing south through the Atlantic because Bligh wanted to take the ship around the Horn and across the South Pacific to Tahiti that way. Well, they ran into the most appalling weather as they approached Cape Horn. They were 3 weeks battling adverse gales, and Bligh is on the record of saying it was the worst sea conditions he'd ever struck. There were 46 men on the ship. They all worked hard to try and control the ship, but eventually, after 3 weeks of struggle, they said, this is enough, we can't do it. And Bligh grudgingly agreed. Fletcher was the one he said to Bligh, "Sir, we will have to turn back." So they put the ship about and sailed across the South Atlantic to Cape Town. More delays, but at least they were able to repair the ship. They left Cape Town a few weeks later, sailed across to what was then Van Diemen's Land, which Bligh had been visiting with Cook, and had done a bit of surveying there. They reprovisioned in Van Diemen's Land, and things on board started to go wrong from about that time. There was a very difficult sailing master, Pryor. He and Bligh rubbed each other up the wrong way. Pryor was a difficult person, and he was insolent towards Bligh on more than one occasion, and Fletcher witnessed this and couldn't understand why Bligh didn't punish him. But Fryer being among the top ranks on board, he couldn't be flogged, but he could be censured or punished in some way, but Bligh didn't punish him. That was a mysterious thing to happen. The other problem they had was with the surgeon. This was Thomas Huggett, who was drunk almost all the time. He brought his own personal supply of booze on board, and he just went straight into the booze every morning, and he was a total liability. And he mistreated one of the able seamen, and James Valentine, and Valentine died. Bligh was furious about that, because even if you had one man short, in a crew of 46, it took a valuable member of the crew out of the working of the ship. They then did a big sweep south of New Zealand. There are some islands called Bligh Islands south of New Zealand, which were named by Bligh. Did that big southern sweep, and eventually arrived in Tahiti in October of 1788. Now, they were meant to be there 3 weeks. Bligh had to organise the purchase of the young breadfruit trees. He had to get on well with the local chief to do that. So he set about ingratiating himself to the main chief of Tahiti. And that all went according to plan, and they started to collect plants. Now, Fletcher was put in charge of the shore camp. The shore camp was at Point Venus, which was where Cook had observed the transit of Venus in 1769. And Fletcher was very pleased to be able to do that. He had a couple of seamen rostered on duty in case there were thefts by the locals, which didn't happen actually much. And so Fletcher, you can imagine how he fell in love with the life there. He'd been on board for weeks and weeks, putrid food, awful discipline, horrible accommodation. Suddenly, he was liberated. He was able to live on the shore. He had the run of Point Venus. He had anything that he wanted, really, provided he oversaw the collection of the plants, and that all went very well. The two botanists were very diligent, David Nelson and William Brown, and they accumulated the plants, but 3 weeks turned into 5 months. There were so many delays, and you can imagine that after 5 months, even 4.5 months on Tahiti, you became pretty well assimilated. And that certainly was the case with Fletcher and several of his mates, and he fell in love. This is beyond dispute. Don't contradict me on that, because there are a lot of there are a lot of progeny around the South Pacific to demonstrate the relationship. Her name was Mautua. Fletcher called her Isabella, after one of his old girlfriends, although he never told her that. And she was a high-born woman from just outside of, not far from Point Venus, and they fell deeply in love. And you could see the mutual attraction, to Fletcher. She was exotic, she was high-born, well-connected, she was a lovely person by all accounts, and for her, he was exotic and different, and he told her about his life on the Isle of Man in England, and it must have been fascinating for her. He got a tattoo. He sort of fell into the island way of life very enthusiastically. Bligh, in the meantime, was strutting around the island being feted by the chiefs, And you can read from his journals the way he loved this, you know, he was treated. He told them he was Cook's son. What a bloody liar he was. And this was done so that he could get onto the right side of the chiefs and get the breadfruit plants. But it was a shocking thing to say. I'm the king, I'm the son of James Cook, because Cook was revered on the island, and then the reverence was transferred to Bligh. This 5 months, an extraordinary amount of time for the Englishmen to be ashore. And things disintegrated. 2 of the men deserted the ship. Some of them were still on the ship, but they entertained their Tahitian girlfriends on the ship and were having a right old time. But they knew that the countdown was starting to their departure. And 2 of the men deserted and sailed across with the aid of some locals to a little atoll called Tetiaroa, which is now owned by Marlon Brando's family. Marlon Brando being Fletcher Christian in 1962. You can see all the wheels within wheels. But the desertion didn't work. They were caught, they were turned in by some other locals and brought back to the ship, and Bligh was furious. He had them flogged, shackled, and then promised them another flogging. He couldn't. Desertion was a capital offence. To desert or to aid and abet desertion was a capital offence. But he couldn't have them hanged on Tahiti because they would be short-handed on the ship, you see. So the 2 deserters were allowed to stay on board but were severely reprimanded. And in the meantime, the rest of the crew were becoming more and more in love with Tahiti and the way of life there. So all this culminated in their departure, which I think was on the 4th of April 1789. Am I right, Kieran? Is that right? You've got a photographic memory for these things. Yes, they sailed away. There was terrible sadness on the part of Tu, the chief, and his wife, who had become good friends with Bligh. A lot of the crew didn't want to leave. They were so enamored of the life on Tahiti. Some of them did want to go. They were homesick, wanted to get back to England. But by and large, they were reluctant to leave. And the most reluctant one was Fletcher, because he'd worked out that his life on Tahiti would be so much better than a life on board. I tried in the novel to get inside his head and depict just how torn he was, knowing that he was duty-bound to sail on that ship, to get away, facing about 6 months on the little tub filled with breadfruit plants, sailing across the Pacific to the east coast of America. Bligh decided to take the ship up the Great Barrier Reef through the Endeavour Straits to Batavia. But they didn't get that far because in April 1789 they approached the islands of Tonga. And one island in particular had something which the Bounty needed, and that was a freshwater lake. Very unusual for a South Pacific island to have a lake in the middle of it. And they stopped there to take on fresh water and coconuts, and it wasn't long after that the mutiny happened.
Graeme, I'd like to...
Yes?
I'd like to invite, before the islands drop completely over the horizon, I'd like to ask Karen perhaps to tell us a little bit more about what Bligh was doing on the island all those 5 months. Yeah. You've mentioned that he was strutting around enjoying the hospitality from the chiefs, but I'm not sure that was all that he was doing, was it?
Yes. Needless to say, there's been a bit of misinformation there. What Graeme says is he castigates Bligh for telling a fib, saying he was Cook's son. If you think about it, you don't know what reception you're going to get, but you know Cook has been a bit of a hero. So you want to make sure you get a good reception as well. So there really was an understandable lie to tell. But this man is being a bit holier than thou, because when Fletcher Christian went back, having turfed Bligh off the boat to almost certain death with 18 others in a little cutter that was almost below the waterline, as 8 of them set off in this, in appalling, not the first day, but after a few days, in appalling seas. He then goes back to Tahiti and says, I've sent my very good friend, the son of Cook, to meet his father. And the two of them are waiting on Aitutaki. And they just want some pigs, and they want some food, and they want some yams, and they want everything from you, and we'll take it all back there. And of course, Tu and all his mates, they give them everything because they want to help Bligh and Cook. Little do they know that Fletcher is maintaining the lie that Cook's still alive when you know he's dead, and Bligh is probably dead in his own estimation. So he's a bigger figure, basically.
He was well taught by Bligh.
Yeah, absolutely. But just going back to the orders that he received from the Admiralty, Bligh was told to go round Cape Horn, and if he couldn't do it, then he'd be allowed to turn around and go round the Cape of Good Hope. So although he was delayed 3 months, so he was leaving in the wrong time of year to get round the Horn, and he would have known it better than many on that ship. He's a great believer in obeying orders. He believed it for himself, but he believed it also in the men who served under him. And that perhaps was one of his undoing, because he had this very rigid authoritarian attitude to a chain of command. And he had undoubtedly a bit of a short temper and could sometimes tongue lash people, but he was, as a disciplinarian, nothing like the way he's portrayed by Hollywood and by others who've written about the Bounties story. When he was on Tahiti, because he had to do this following orders, then could say, well, I did try for 3 weeks to get round the Horn, and I couldn't do it, so we went back. By then, he'd arrived at the wrong time of year in Tahiti to take his plants. So they had to be nurtured by the two botanists, or gardeners, more than botanists they had on board. So that's why they had to wait so many months. And while Bligh did, obviously had to negotiate the whole time with the chiefs and keep everyone very happy, he had to stay behind to make sure those plants were ready to be transferred, because his instructions were they had to be in good condition to actually plant on the islands in the West Indies. And some had to go back also to the Royal Gardens at Kew. So that's the reason why he waited so long. And as Graeme has rightly said, it led to a lot of attacks being made, not just Fletcher Christian. Other men formed partnerships with island women, and that was to lead to difficulties thereafter. But I'll let Graeme carry on with this story now.
Well, I'm just going to say,
Yep.
we have now come to the events of the mutiny, and as you've heard, everybody was extremely unhappy. Christian was far from happy because he left his lover behind, and he was becoming increasingly anguished by slack discipline and Bligh's foul-mouthed verbal attacks on the crew, but particularly on him. And he had been a protege and a long-time friend, going way back, as you've heard. So this was he was becoming increasingly distracted. So much so that he even planned a suicidal escape on a makeshift raft from the ship to a distant island. So that's the scene that we've now set for the night of the 28th of April, when something happened with Christian. Fletcher Christian snapped in probably, but I'll let Graeme take up the story at this point.
I think we should try to visualise what these two men were like. Fletcher Christian never had his portrait painted because he was too young. You had to be, you know, at least in your 30s.
Do you want to use this?
Can't you hear me at the back? You had to, you know, if you were a distinguished person, you had your portrait painted. Fletcher was too young to have his portrait painted, but they have, from contemporary descriptions and comments about him, they've put together a portrait of what he probably was like, portrayed in his midshipman's uniform. He was tall, as I said, very athletic, dark, had a propensity to sweat when he was, in difficulties, which embarrassed him even when he was a boy. That's the only image we have of Fletcher Christian, but I think it's probably fairly accurate. It's like a combination of Marlon Brando and Mel Gibson, which is ours. By contrast, my learned friend's protege William Bligh did have his portrait painted because he became a person of great eminence, and that's the portrait that's usually, you see the mean little mouth? and the boring eyes, and a thoroughly unpleasant person. But Fletcher had always had a tendency to depression. He was oversensitive in many ways, and he used to become depressed. I've tried to convey that tendency to depression when he was laid off from the Navy and didn't know what he was going to do. Certainly he became depressed when he knew that he was going to be faced with probably 6 months at sea with the poisonous dwarf, which was his commander. Strangely enough, when I was reading about Bligh and writing about it, I kept thinking of Rob Muldoon. I thought, and I think it was because Bligh was a little man. He was about 5'2". Fletcher was well over 6 feet, and the contrast between their the physical appearance of those two men was marked. And I think, and I'm not trying to be an amateur psychologist about it, but I think Bligh was jealous of Fletcher, jealous of his popularity with the other members of the crew, certainly jealous of the fact that he'd found this wonderful lover on the island. And he started to, as they approached the waters of Tonga, he started to treat Fletcher very, very badly. Now, some revisionist historians have said that, oh, Bligh was okay, he didn't flog nearly as many men as Cook did, and that was true. Bligh didn't have to flog them. He flogged them with his tongue. He had a vicious tongue and a great locker full of swear words. I had great fun finding all these words from 18th century swearing and putting them in the story. But he did. If you got dressed down by Bligh on the deck in front of the other men, you never forgot it. Well, he directed his ire against Fletcher more and more towards the end of April. And this culminated in him accusing Fletcher of stealing coconuts. Now, what a trivial and petty thing to do. They'd taken a lot of coconuts on board on Nomuka, stacked them around the deck. There were heaps of them. They got them next to nothing. But Bligh came out on the ship on the morning, the 27th of April, and said, someone's taken my coconuts, and it was you, wasn't it, Christian? And Fletcher said, he said, well, I took one coconut, you know, well, so what, you know? And then the invective from Bligh directed at Fletcher was just appalling. And he called him a coward, he called him a thief, he called him a liar. Now, this is towards a fellow officer on the ship. If they'd been civilians, there would have been a duel, I'm sure. But they couldn't fight a duel in the Navy, so he just had to humiliate him in that way. And Fletcher, whose mental state was not good, it became worse and worse, and he decided to leave the ship in this harebrained scheme of building a raft and deserting. I mean, it was ridiculous. And his friend, the carpenter Purcell, said, don't do it, it's crazy. And then a little man from Orkney, Edward Young, who had West Indian blood, he was a midshipman too, he was a mate of Fletcher's, said, take the ship, the men are with you. And Fletcher went to bed that night thinking, I can't stand this. His options were limited. Leaving the ship, couldn't do it. Staying on the ship, impossible. He's found Bligh now impossible. What made it worse was after he'd abused him in front of the men, Bligh would then turn around and say, oh, will you dine with me tonight, Mr. Christian? And this was just appalling. Fletcher couldn't understand it. One minute he was the subject of abuse, and the next minute he was being invited to dine with him. It was just, he must have felt a terrible sense of betrayal, because remember, they'd been friends. And Bligh had taught Fletcher so much about sailing. So when Edward Young said, take the ship, he decided to do it. Now, he didn't have many men on his side at that stage, though a lot of them were uncommitted. Some said they would join him. What they needed was weapons. and they managed to get into the armaments chest, and they got hold of muskets, cutlasses, knives, daggers, swords, and as dawn broke on the 28th of April 1789, they went to Fly's cabin. They tied him up, took him up on the deck, and held the ship up, and Fletcher took over command. Now, I won't go into all the details of that, but as Kieran said, Bligh wasn't killed. He was set adrift in the launch with 18 men. It was tantamount to sending him to his death. But Bligh was such a determined and courageous person and a very fine navigator. He managed to sail 3,000 miles through the Great Barrier Reef, through the Endeavour Straits, to Timor, and they survived with about 6 inches of freeboard at the launch. I just don't know how he did it. And while he was doing that, Bligh was keeping his journal every day. And you can read the journal of those months after the mutiny. Copper plate handwriting, beautifully written. How did he do it? I just can't imagine. But he did it, and he survived, and then he got back to England. Fletcher's story really has only just started, because he had to find a sanctuary for himself and his fellow mutineers, and that took a very long time. Went back to Tahiti, told lies, that's quite true. What Kieran said, had to tell lies, and he'd been well taught by Bligh in that respect. So they tried to find a sanctuary. They couldn't stay on Tahiti because they knew that the Tahitians would turn them in when the next sailing ship came from Europe. They went to a little island called Tubuai in the Austral group, tried to start a settlement there. That didn't work, so they went back to Tahiti and set sail to search for an island sanctuary, one that was uninhabited, and there were very few that weren't inhabited at that stage, and they found it in the form of a rock way the hell out in the Pacific, miles away from any other land, and it was called Pitcairn. And really that's just the beginning.
Before we get on to the Pitcairn story, I'm going to take us back to the night of the mutiny and ask Kieran to tell us what Bligh must have felt when he woke up to find himself being threatened with muskets, swords, and his longtime friend and protege standing over him, looking very menacing.
He wrote a number of things after the mutiny. He wrote to his wife, told her some of his thoughts, and he wrote an official account, and he published a number of books. And so what I'm going to read to you is something from his first narrative of the mutiny, which describes his take on why it happened. And I think it confirms something that Graeme has already said to you, and I'll just read this to you. It will very naturally be asked, what could be the reason for such a revolt? In answer to which I can only conjecture that the mutineers had assured themselves of a more happy life among the Otaheitans than they could possibly have in England, which, joined to some female connections, have most probably been the principal cause of the whole distraction. The women at Otaheite are handsome, mild, cheerful in their manners and conversation, possessed of great sensibility, and have sufficient delicacy to make them admired and beloved. The chiefs were so much attached to our people that they rather encouraged their stay, and even made them promises of large possessions. Under these and many other attendant circumstances equally desirable, it is now perhaps not so much to be wondered at, though scarcely possible to have been foreseen, that a set of sailors, most of whom void of connections, should be led away, especially when, in addition to such powerful inducements, they imagined it in their power to fix themselves in the midst of plenty, on the finest island in the world, where they need not labour, and where the allurements of dissipation are beyond anything that could be conceived. The utmost, however, that any commander could have supposed to happen is that some of them would have been tempted to desert. Desertions have happened, more or less, from many of the ships that have been to the Society Islands, but it has never been in the commander's powers, to make the chiefs return their people. That knowledge, therefore, that it was unsafe to desert, perhaps first led my people to consider with what ease so small a ship might be surprised, and that so favourable an opportunity would never offer itself again. So that was, in a very brief, his summation of what happened on the mutiny. And while he remonstrated with them, was calling on some others on the deck with him to, because his hands were tied behind his back, he would be dragged from his bed in his nightshirt, and others were under guard with guns at them, their head or whatever, so that none of them dared move. I think if some of them had tried, there might have been a bit of a fight and a bloodbath, but I think they might have succeeded in saving the ship from being taken. But be that as it may, 18 men were sent onto that boat. Some were held back by Christian because he wanted some of their skills, and what Bligh made a careful note of in that log that was kept on this boat that took them over to Timor was the names of all those that were on the ship. The mutineers, in other words, gave a description of all of them very carefully, and he set that out so that he would have it when he got back there. And he got the pooled recollections of all the men that were with him on that boat to describe each person, because they'd all had, a lot of them anyway, had tattoos while they were on Tahiti, and so they would describe their various Tahitian tattoos that they'd had and other tattoos as well. And a detailed description was given for each of the mutineers, and against 4 of those names, Bligh noted very carefully that they had been taken or held back on the boat against their inclination, as he put it, as they wanted to come with him. So that when they eventually were rounded up later on, he'd put in a good word for those 4 who were held against their will. And so they then all, as you know, went their separate ways. That journey that Graeme's just told you about is phenomenal. It's not just that, in fact, he kept a journal every day so carefully. When they sailed through the Fiji Islands, he made a point of charting them because it was the first European to do so. He drew the islands so that they would be a record for the Admiralty when he got back. So confident was he in being able to get back, and so disciplined a person he was. He may have been a disciplinarian as far as his men were concerned, but he was also self-disciplined, so that he very carefully weighed out the very meagre food that they had. And to any of you who have been to the Royal Naval College at Greenwich and have seen the museum there, the coconut shell that he used for himself is there, and scraped on it William Bligh, April 1789, just so it wouldn't be confused with any other coconut shells. And he has they found a little bit of shot in the base of the boat, and he used that as a weighing device to weigh up the so that each person on that boat, himself included, got exactly the same measurement of food and the same measurement of water, because they were given some water as well, and they also had some rum. But he was incredibly disciplined about that, and because he was so disciplined, he was able to get those men, all bar one, to Timor. And he got them to Timor. The one who was killed had a man called Norton. They had stopped on an island where they had had a friendly reception before, not all the mutineers, but where Bligh, when he was with Cook, had had a friendly reception. On this occasion, they were not friendly. So as they tried to get away, Norton stayed behind to try and free the grapnel of the anchor. Bligh was telling him, just skip it, come, we'll just cut the rope, but he tried, and then he was stoned to death by the natives on that island. So that thereafter, Bligh made a decision, we're not stopping on a single island so that he didn't stop at any of the Fijian islands at all, because he said you just cannot guarantee what that reception will be, no matter how they were before. Eventually, when they came to the Great Barrier Reef, and he knew that part from earlier trips of his, that they just looked for an opening in the reef, and they got through into the calmer waters. But until then, they'd had a terrible weather, shockingly high seas, but the weather was being so good for them, in fact, because it provided fresh water in rain. If it hadn't been for that, if you'd had those sort of blistering sunlit days, which we all hope for when we go to the tropical islands in the winter to get away from an Auckland winter, they would have all been frazzled to death. So in fact, the weather served them ill and served them well at the same time, and that helped them keep alive. And they were able, in fact, to stop on an island in the Great Barrier Reef there, and after a while they noticed some signs of occupation, and then they decided to leave before they tested whether they were friendly or not, and then he sailed on to Kupang. Well, he got all 18 of them, or 17 of them and himself, to the Dutch East Indies. In fact, some of them thereafter contracted disease while in the East Indies, and 4 of them died, but the rest were able to get back to the United Kingdom, save one who died en route on the boat back. So that covers that part of the journey, unless there's anything more that Graeme wanted to say on that.
Yeah, Bligh, no doubt, was heroic in what he did. There was no question of that. It was one of the epic voyages of all time. But my interest lies just as much in what happened to Fletcher afterwards, because... Sorry. Yes, because this is really just the beginning of the story from Fletcher's point of view. Having found Pitcairn, that in itself was fortuitous. The island of Pitcairn had been logged erroneously by the Royal Navy a few years earlier. They couldn't establish longitude very accurately at that stage, and the naval ship that had come upon this island a few years before the mutiny had longed it incorrectly, and Kieran said it was 200 miles out. The latitude was correct, and Fletcher realised that if they sailed along the latitude line, they would eventually come to Pitcairn, and indeed they did. Now, again, that's just the beginning of the story, because the community they set up there and what happened to that community is... There have been an enormous number of books written about it, and understandably, because it's such an interesting story. And Kieran and I have both had the privilege of being to Pitcairn and seeing the descendants of Fletcher and Moatua. You know, this fusion of the old world and the new world, of the Polynesians and Europeans, it's still there. I went fishing with Randy Christian, who one of Fletcher's great-great-great-great-grandson, and the longboat was steered by Steve Christian, and all the other Christians, descendants are there, plus the descendants of the other mutineers, and they all trace their lineage back to those events of 1789. The gene pool, as you would expect, got smaller and smaller in the 19th century. They intermarried, they had large families. Occasionally a sailor would wash up there and stay, like a man called Buffett. And then an American missionary came in the 1880s, I think, and converted the whole island to Seventh-day Adventism. They're all Seventh-day Adventists now. They don't drink, they don't smoke. Well, I think some of them drink. But they very keen churchgoers. It's a weird little church. I went to it and had to leave halfway through the service. I couldn't stand it anymore. That's what they were bequeathed by the outsiders, and the gene pool did get bigger. Now the population, which at one stage was over 300 in the 19th century, is down to about 47 people. And people have asked me, well, what's going to happen in the future? And probably, Kieran, you could probably comment on that. You've been there more recently.
Yes, and perhaps you could also tell us something about the court-martial. If Bligh's reputation by this time was so bad, why in fact was he acquitted? I think that's quite something we need to know.
Yeah, Bligh's reputation was not bad. Hollywood and Edward Christian are responsible for his present-day reputation and for that book.
Objection, Your Honour.
In that book, he says he researched all sorts of language from the 18th century, and he's put it all into the mouth of William Bligh. Not one witness at any court-martial ever put any of those words into William Bligh's mouth. It is florid, interesting to read, and a total misrepresentation. Anyway, you're allowed poetic license as a novelist, but don't regard it as historical fact. William Bligh returned in 1790, and when the remainder of the crew who'd been with him on that boat arrived back, then all were court-martialed. And the reason being, they had lost one of His Majesty's ships. And an account has to be made of them, and it was no mere formality over in an hour. They all of them were examined about what they did, what more could have been done to save the ship, and things of that sort. One person was reprimanded, not for an incident in relation to the loss of the Bounty itself, but a man called Purcell for insubordination during, on a number of occasions, during his dealings with Bligh before and after the mutiny itself. And so he was exonerated from the loss of the ship, and it was taken by mutiny. And so in 1792, the remaining mutineers, not all of them were brought back, some had died and some died en route in another story of a very savage naval captain called Captain Edward Edwards. That's another part of the saga that I can leave one side, but that ship had foundered and they'd all been locked in a sort of thing which was known as Pandora's Box, the name of the boat, and he was refusing to let them out of there. Unfortunately, one of the seamen did let the others escape, but some of them died. I think 4 of them died with that ship when it foundered. And Edward Edwards went for court-martial too because he'd lost his boat and so on and so forth. But anyway, coming back to our little saga, the mutineers who eventually were returned to England in 1792 were all tried. And 4 of them, the ones for whom Bligh had put in a good word and said they were only held back against their will on the boat, they were acquitted. Although again, that was examined quite carefully. I mean, the court-martial went on for just over 2 weeks, so it wasn't any mere formality. And everyone was examined. Bligh, by now, was actually busy taking another lot of breadfruit, which he collected from Tahiti, and he successfully transported to the West Indies. And so they did get breadfruit there, and that's why you now see it growing in the West Indies. The slaves didn't, by the way, eat a single bit of the breadfruit until they were emancipated in 1838, and then they agreed to eat the breadfruit, but up until they didn't. So it was a bit of a failure from that point of view, but it wasn't anything to do with Bligh's failure. He'd done what he was tasked to do. But in the account given by those who are now facing court-martial for mutiny and for desertion, there was a lot of close examination by the courts of effectively a jury of 12 sea captains presided over by Lord Hood, and then the other 11 were naval captains, all with quite distinguished careers of their own. And they very closely examined each of the witnesses about what they'd done and what they could have done better, or, and who had really helped and who hadn't. Apart from the 4 that Bligh put a good word in, all the rest were convicted and sentenced to be hanged. But they put in the tribunal put in a plea for clemency in respect of 2 of them, and a 3rd was also further pardoned because there'd been an irregularity in the trial that he wasn't allowed to call 2 witnesses whom he had wanted to call. And so 3 men, because 10 eventually went for trial, 4 were acquitted, 6 were convicted, 3 were hung, and the other 3 were pardoned. And the pardon means, no, it's what you've done wrong, but we're not going to sentence you to death for a variety of reasons. And one of those was a guy called Peter Hayward, who had a very, because of his social position and the social position of his family, a bit like Fletcher Christian's, had a good backing of people who were willing to put together a defence team. The others were just, a lot of them able seamen, had no such social status at all. And so they just did it on their own behalf and cross-examined witnesses and things of that sort. But the other had a very good sort of legal team, but he still wasn't saved from the conviction, but he was actually saved. This is Peter Hayward. He was one of the ones who was pardoned. But what happened after the trial was Edward Christian, this is the Downing Professor of Law at Cambridge and a barrister, who was a brother of Fletcher Christian's, went into bat for his brother. And the image that we now have of Bligh starts to stem from that, but not from anything said at any of the courts-martial. Not one witness ever complained of Bligh's behaviour as being in any way responsible for the mutiny. They did say he had a bit of a short temper and he could flare up, but as soon as he flared up he would flare down again, and then he would forget and forgive. The person he may have shouted at may not forget, but Bligh, it was all over and done with, and he was hail fellow well met the next time. And he had a sharp tongue. But when you look at the language that is ascribed to him, none of it is anything recorded in that book. They said he called them shocking things like dotards, something that Mr. King has learned from law. He's obviously been reading the account of those courts-martials. And dolt, and they'd, even the word bugger appears, but nothing worse. There was, after that incident, there were, as I've said, there was this incident in 1808 when he was overthrown in New South Wales, and one of the leader of the Rum Corps was court-martialed, and effectively, again, it was Bligh against him. So Bligh was sort of on trial for his behaviour as Governor of New South Wales, and you had a couple of people coming along giving evidence for this man Johnson, saying, oh, and he used such language, I couldn't mention it in front of this court. And I just think, well, just hang on, you know, you're dealing with a whole pile of convicts, and you're the Rum Corps, and you're running this lot, and you're just being a bit priggish when you say, well, the language was just too shocking for words. On the Bounty, Fletcher Christian may have been a social notch above Bligh, but again, the rest of them were basically seamen who must have been used to fairly fruity language amongst themselves and to each other when they were angry. And to say that you could be so lashed by the tongue that you would crumble over an accusation over a few coconuts is just really taking things a bit too far. But after that, Edward Christian really went into bat for Bligh and started to create this image of this hugely vociferous tongue lashing he would give, and also an absolute bastard with the lash. Now, as we know, and has been fairly conceded, we know he used the lash far less than Captain Cook, for example. He used the lash only on 10%. Compared, these are the calculations done, not by me, but by all these eminent historians, like Anne Salmond and that woman who wrote Caroline Alexander and things like that. I mean, Cook used it on 25% of his crew. Vancouver, you know, used it on 45% of his. And there's a whole pile of others showing that Bligh was perhaps one of the least cruel of commanders. He resorted to the lash far less than nearly every one of the other captains in that period. And so he was not the cruel bastard that you see in Charles Lawton. Great portrayal by Charles Lawton, but it has nothing to do with this. And it's based on this man, Edward Christian, who really went into bat. And so Edward Christian, again, with all the power of his position as a barrister and as a Downing Professor of Law, and with all that he could get together, suddenly re-interviewed everybody else and got different stories out of them to the ones that have been told at courts-martial. And no doubt, with a motive to get his brother, because his brother wasn't there, but it was very important for the family, who, as you know, had a social position of sorts, who were very anxious to maintain it and not have it eroded by actually being cast as a mutineer. And so from then, you see a lot of books that base themselves on Edward Christian's account, and then the films do the same. And to Hollywood, it's not very good if he's not really a nasty chap, and Errol Flynn or Marlon Brando or whatever wouldn't be cast as Bligh, because it doesn't make good telly, basically. And so you get that image that really has got nothing to do with the historical reality of William Bligh. And so while he had faults, and no one would dispute those, and people did use the Bounty afterwards to say, well, he was in one mutiny and now he's in another. You know, for example, another mutiny they really lash Bligh with is the mutiny of the Nore, which some of you may or may not have heard of. It was when sailors mutinied, and they first of all mutinied at Spithead, but they mutinied at Spithead and then at the Nore. Sailors had not had their pay increased for 120 years. Now, the Navy, the Army, just got a pay rise about 3 or 4 years before, but nothing for the Navy. And so that was one of their grievances. There were a number of grievances, and when you think what was happening across the Channel in France, people who were at the bottom end of the social heap were willing to suddenly speak up for once and start to complain. And so they had a mutiny at the Nore, and what they did was they seized them really unpopular officers, the captains, and expelled them from the ship. Some they actually tarred and feathered. But they never did that to Bligh. At the end of a week, they cast Bligh off, but he wasn't in that first tranche of these are the officers who really are appalling, we hate them, and they're nasty commanders. Bligh remained with his men on his boat, on his ship, shall I say. And so Bligh later actually went and negotiated with them they couldn't have trusted all officers to do that, and eventually helped, not just he alone, but to settle the mutiny at the north. And so although that's often cast as he was involved in yet another mutiny, when you look at the way he was involved in it, it really speaks in his favour rather than speaks against him. And so Bligh is nothing like the villain that the films and the books have sought to create him. He's actually a man with a very mixed personality, of course. Faults, like his temper, and like the use of his tongue, maybe, which can be belittling to some people. But these are hardened seamen. They aren't school kids, or they're hardened convicts in New South Wales. And so, whatever you might else say, and you can forgive him that, because his many other qualities as a commander of men are attested to by, even you only just look at that 4,000-mile journey from being abandoned at Tafua up to Timor.
Thank you, Karen. I think we've had a fascinating evening. We're going to take a show of hands in a minute, but I'd just like to perhaps give Graeme another chance to
Thank you very much.
speak in favour of...
That's so kind of you. And what a great defence was mounted by Bligh's counsel. I'm sure he would have hired you on the spot if had you been in England in 1792. But when we have thinking about the two men, I'm always interested in comparing Bligh with Cook. Now, Cook lashed more men than Bligh did, that's true. Cook was bad-tempered as well, could fall into foul tempers with his men. Never was there any suggestion of mutiny against Cook. That was an unthinkable thing to do. And that seems to me to sum up the difference between those two men. Cook, an immensely talented man, respected deeply, a staunch disciplinarian, had his men flogged if they didn't eat the right food that he'd prescribed for them. Never, never any suggestion of a mutiny. And I think we can probably agree on the fact that both Bligh and Christian were deeply flawed personalities. The flaws went much deeper in Bligh's case. But just to sum up their characteristics, Bligh was courageous, diligent, but he nursed grievances for years, was uncertain of his social standing, and he was hot-tempered, and I'm sorry, Karen, but he was foul-mouthed. As evidence, now James Morrison, have you read his testimony? Christian was physically strong and popular with his shipmates, but he was also impetuous, overly sensitive to criticism, and he had a tendency to depression. He may have even been bipolar, but that's a retrospective diagnosis. But of the two men, I would have much preferred to go out on the town with Fletcher rather than the poisonous dwarf, the commander of the Bligh. Thank you very much.
What an entertaining night we've had. Graeme has suggested that we have a show of hands at this point. And the question is, there are two parts to this question. Which of you think that Fletcher was justified in taking the action he did against Bligh? I'm asking the question, and those of you who believe that Fletcher was justified in taking the action against Bligh, you would, of course. Okay, do we need to, would you like to stand up and just sort of get a feel for how many we've got here?
Yeah, just put your hands up again. Hundreds of them.
Okay, well thank you. So, those of you who feel that that he was not justified, in other words, your sympathies really are with Bligh.
Oh dear.
I don't think it's quite close, I think. Not close enough for Graeme, possibly it is for Kerry. Just to wrap up, I asked Graeme if possibly I could read a little bit from Anne Salmond, who, as we know, is, I'm sorry about this crackle, is the great Cook scholar, and has also written a magnificent book about Bligh, which came out a few years ago. Here it is here. It's well thumbed, because I think, Graeme, it was one of your source material.
Took it to Pitcairn.
Took it to Pitcairn, okay.
Hid it under the bed because I didn't want to.
This is the exact book. It's Anne Salmon's biography of Bligh. But I think it does perhaps sum up, would answer the question, why are we still talking about this these days? What relevance is there to this, to our modern life and to the life of the Royal Navy? Because mutinies were not all that common, were they? They were relatively few and far between, because it was a capital offence for anybody to take a ship. So Anne, I think, has given in her book quite a good summing up of why we're still talking about it, and what is, well, I'll just quote her. Why are we doing this? Because the tale of the mutiny on the Bounty and its aftermath is not just a Western story. At its heart, the historical and mythic trajectories of Britain and the South Seas intersect, transforming lives on the island as well as on board the ships and back in Europe. This is an episode in the history of the world, not simply the history of the West, and the Pacific protagonists were as real as their British counterparts, helping to shape what happened. So that what happened in the conflict between these two very interesting and flawed men, and I have to say I'm on the Bligh side. I'm allowed to say that now. But what happened between those men and the incredible stories of each of them, Fletcher Christian on Pitcairn and Bligh back in England and his naval career, has really come right down the ages as one of the great universal stories. But it also involves the Pacific peoples that both their lives touched. And so I would like to, on that note, would like to thank both Karen and Graeme for their magnificent retellings on behalf of their protagonists. And I think at that point we would be wishing you a very happy night.
It's my pleasure to observe one of our rituals of presenting to those luminaries who have been on the speaking standard today with a bottle with which they may revive their things. I've been an admirer of Tessa's ever since the early days of the Children's Literature Association, thank you. I'm happy to thank you, Tessa, for the good work that you've done in that respect. Kieran, it's been a pleasure to meet you and to see your ultra-realism coming out. And we all like a racehorse that comes from behind to win the race at the last minute. Graeme is a bit more of a shadier character. He's lived in Devonport under considerable anonymity for many years, and he sometimes has been known in public to badmouth the city of Stratford, where he wasn't born, but where he spent a certain amount of his time growing up. I've just discovered a little bit about Stratford. Yes.
Open necky, actually.
In that case, I won't read this. He has an excuse. He has an alibi. Yes. One moment.
It is rum, I hope.
The finest French brandy. Yes. Tessa, thank you very much for your judicial behaviour today.
Thank you.
Kieran,
Thank you.
Congratulations. And
Thanks.
yes. Very nice. the last and most important thing, you can really decide the fate of this by looming up large to the book table and buying copies of Graeme's books, and I'm sure you'll be happy to sign some, would you? He's very happy to do that. Good, thank you.